Yes, no. Sampling is just the way you go about categorizing things. So let's have a look. Who's got me? And I need you to give me some comments because then it makes sense of this. What did you come up with when you looked at the set of cars here? How many people, what have you got for population? Total number of vehicles. Who's got what numbers? And it doesn't, there's no right number. I don't have a number either. I didn't actually go do it. I have something to compare. It's just the idea of you thinking about how would you figure out the total number of vehicles in a parking lot like this? They're also in different spots. Who's got, anybody got a rough number?
So 100.
Sorry?
700.
700? Okay. How'd you come up with that?
It's a
Roughly.
random number. I
Just
guess it's 15, 20 cars per row here. And it's about 20, 25 rows.
Good. So perfect. If you've got that, that's how I would do it. I would count this row, or whether you count just one row here, or you count whether it's that, or whether you count all of this and say that's a row, whatever. And it doesn't matter how you define row. What would matter with row is that you define it and you say, here's what a row means. A row means one set of vehicles parked door to door, or a row means two vehicles parked either touching nose to nose or bumper to bumper, and they're the row where, and there's an aisle in between where vehicles can drive. You would need to explain that quite well if you're doing it on this picture. Although we aren't doing just the picture, there's more to it than that. We're gonna look at Bacagulia. I get it wrong every time, but we're gonna look at that article to see how they've done it. So good. So you looked at the rows, you count the rows, you estimate. Did you include, so anybody else, did you include these in the back, these big yellow trucks? Anybody?
No.
No? Okay. Why not?
No.
No.
Okay. Why not? What are you thinking? Again, it's not right or wrong. It's just, what was your thought process? Anybody?
Because they're not the regular cars.
Because they're not which?
Regular cars.
Okay, that's fair. And that's good. There's the key. You're allowed to do it any way you want. As long as you can describe to somebody else what you did, how and why, then that's good enough. So this, when you look at this, you've got, did anybody count just cars, like look like sort of passenger vehicles, and leave out trucks? Or did any of you think of?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Did any of you think that will include anything that moves, anything on wheels?
That's what I was going with, anything that moves.
Okay. Good.
I cut the screen into 4.
Oh, okay. Well done.
Like did 4 quadrants and then I counted the bottom left quadrant first.
Yeah.
And tried to go off that because that's where the most cars seem to be.
Yeah. So you did this.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. And then, so when you counted this bottom corner?
Yeah.
All right. And then what did you do? Just times it by 4?
Yeah.
Good. It's like in it. It's all good. There's no right way to do your sampling. So sampling becomes how do you determine how many's out there? But then it's the sense of looking at that whole picture and saying, and how do I determine what I'm going to rely on to represent the whole of the population? I'm going to rely on this corner. I'm going to rely on every 5th car. I'm going to rely on walking down the rows and just picking randomly. Be careful with random. We'll come to random in just a minute. But these rows are certainly easier to work with. They're straight rows, right? This is going to be a much closer estimate. What do you do when you get way up here though in the mess? Right? Like these are all kind of spread out. The rows are a bit lost. Depending on my topic, I'm going to look at my sample differently. So for me, I said the term vehicles. So vehicles to me means everything with wheels. That would include this, probably a trailer. That would include the trucks. That would include the camper vans. But if I said what kind of cars are there, and did all of you clue into that? That was the question, right? What kind of vehicles are in the lot? Did you answer that?
Yeah.
Good. A lot of people miss that first question. Because I've given you step by step and you go down through those steps, people fall into line doing that. So it is that you can take it and turn it into this, identify the big issue, and then you look at how do I identify what's in that population, and then how do I pull out a subset that's reasonable. That's sampling. Sampling is that method, that process of going in. Sampling exists in every research project. That's a really important point. It is not a separate method. If you do interviews of 4 people, you decide which 4 people you're doing. That's the sampling. You're sampling. You're going about doing it. It's the way you decide where you're going to collect your data from and how much data do you collect. That process exists in every project. So it's not a separate method. It's included in everything. So whether you did quadrants or you did the rows, maybe you're used to being in parking lots and vehicles, so you can estimate it out. You looked at it and said, wow, that looks like about 500 cars. Why? In my experience. So if you go with in my experience, that's called anecdotal research, commentary. Somebody just tells you what they think, but it's based in some kind of experience. If you just get that from one person, it's seen as anecdotal, and in research, it's usually seen as not worth much. We won't rely on that. But if you got several people, if you had 5 or 6 people with experience in parking lots who said, it looks like about 500, 600 cars, and you get that from 5 different sources who have all got background experience, you put those anecdotal commentaries together, and now we call it research, and now we call it data, and it validates it. So it's a way, it's a process of doing the selection, I think selection of what you're going to look at. Categorizing. So in the categorizing, did any of you categorize the vehicles at all? Go about that process?
Yeah, what I kind of did in my head was when we were talking about cars, that means passenger vehicles, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But there are different passenger vehicles are different than trucks, like pickup trucks or minivans or buses or these kind of vehicles.
Yeah. They're more
so yeah, I kind of categorize them based on the number of the seats that are inside the car and the number of the wheels.
Well done. That works. That's and you can explain that and make sense of that to me. So perfect. What about this? Like here with this is a van with no windows, probably 2-seater.
Probably 2-seater, yeah.
Right? Delivery van, probably. What about something like this?
I would put it in the minivan category.
Okay. So, and that's good as long, all you would have to do is explain how and why, and that makes it okay. So you say anything that's got, so in something like this, it's kind of hard, but you would say maybe, like I said, seating capacity is a good idea. Windows for multiple people, for more than just the typical 5-seater vehicle. Anything bigger than that is minivan, SUV. Some people in the other class left out anything that looked like a van or SUV. They just counted cars. Some other people said cars and SUVs, nothing else. So, but then you get the odd one that is sort of an outlier, if you want to call it. It's that odd one that sticks out and say, oh, where does this fit? What do I do with it? That notion sort of sets up, how do we feel about it? What do we see? What do we think? So if you do the, the outlier, the odd one, categorizing your sample. Now here's where I talked before last week about aggregate data. So you could talk about the number of vehicles, the kind of vehicles that are here. There's minivans, there's vans, there's passenger vans. There appears to be working vehicles. There's trucks, there's sleeping vehicles, recreational vehicles. So in it though, you've got like one trailer, one of these, whatever this thing is, big van sort of thing. So what I would do with that is you've got to be careful that you don't identify it by accident. If you're talking about who's here and the types of vehicles they are and where they're parked, this one doesn't really fit in a different category. If you fit it in its own category, you wouldn't want to speak about a category that only has one or two people in it. So go from the cars to the people, because you identify them by accident. If you think about our class we have let's go by age in our class. We have probably 17, 18-year-old, 19, 20 as another category, 21, 22. That's going to capture most of our classroom. But then there's going to be people over 22. So do we say 22 to 25? Do we say 25 to 30 and then over 30? Or do we just say, well, this captures most, so we're going to make everybody over 22. So you've got 17, 18, right? 19 and 20, and you might do 21, 22, and then this is everybody over 22. You categorize it in a way, so there's two things, one of it, any way you like that makes sense of the data, makes it manageable. The other one though is the confidentiality or privacy of the people. If you've only got a couple people that are older in the class, I would make it everybody above 22, because that'd capture maybe 4 or 5 people. That's good. If I break it down into small groups, so I stay in two-year increments over 22, I'm down to a position where I might identify somebody by accident. When I report on the data and I report on the group that is 25 to 26, then I'm in trouble, because that data gets me, there's only one person in that group. Over 30, that might work. So those things start to very much weigh in. Let's have a look at, I'm just going to pull up back in Categorizing. Just a second. There's your old graph. Where is it? Come on. There we go. Download. Where did it go now? It didn't open. Just a sec. So back at Googlia, why I post that on the website for you to look at. What's important to look at it is how they go about the sampling. You don't need to read the whole thing. For ECE, it's quite interesting actually, but for the rest of us, it is as well. But it's, what it really gets at is they've described really well how they've gone about their sampling. How did they decide who to include and what? Where am I? Week. There it is. View item. Here it comes. Here it comes. Sorry for the delay. Okay. I'll share the screen. So here's something to think about, and this sort of goes outside the course, but how to read when you read an academic paper. if you've got the abstract talks about it's like it's not the Cole's Notes version. It's the little statement that draws people in. It gives you what they did and it gives you the outcome of what they did. And it's about, right, strategies for interpersonal conflict. What do they do? What do children do? So in it, they've said right up the front, this is like the, it's kind of like in the course outline. Here's what you're going to read about. That's the abstract. You should always read that abstract because it gives you the very broad overview of it. Very valuable. Then you hit the introduction. At the introduction, you've got, they run through the whole of the article essentially in the intro. They lay out what's going on, what they did, and then they will go through, and here's the difference between this versus a novel. A novel, we read it, there's little exciting points, the closer at the end. This isn't done that way. Make a statement of what I'm going to show you, tell you what the outcomes are, and then at the end I go, and then I do all the steps to show you how I did it. The intro is the Cole's Notes version. So if you're really pressed for time, at least read the intro on any book you read. So here's what they talk about. So here's their issue, inclusion of children's storytelling in preschool. They realize it's a big part of it. They realize there's some possible violence in stories, and what do children do with that? So they're curious. This is sort of an extension of the notion that children growing up watching video games are going to become violent. Maybe yes, maybe no. The video games alone, I don't think you can prove that. There's going to be other intervening variables. I can think of examples of children who grew up playing video games, who grew up playing probably quite violent video games. What was the one? What's the one all the boys were playing? Grand Theft Auto, I think it was. Like Mario, right? Mario's all bumping, boop, 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 but they jump on the Koopa, they crush the alligator. That could still be, from a child's point of view, people will tell you that still counts as violence, even though it's a cartoon character jumping on the head of another one, right? Mario gets out a little hammer, boop, 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 and bumps everything. Or the original Mario stuff, violence. The old cartoons of the old days, violence. Bugs Bunny, Wile E. Coyote, right? The Roadrunner thing, Popeye. That's what I grew up on. We didn't all turn out violent and crazy. And I look at the kids who grew up on Grand Theft Auto. I didn't like it, but they didn't necessarily turn out violent. Some of the difficulty that I think is interesting, where some have tried to claim that the more realistic the characters are, the more difficult it is for children to differentiate. If every time in a video game you shoot somebody, and this came out of a real live incident in the US, there was a kid that was involved in a shooting. And he was, when the police get there, and he's quite upset, he's traumatized. He just shot and killed somebody. I don't know if he killed him, but he shot him. He'd never smelled blood. And he's that close and shot somebody, and he felt the emotion, he smelled it, all of his senses come alive in the real world. And he said he didn't stand up. He didn't get back up. Because the video game felt so realistic to him, he thought real life would emulate the video game. It's very sad. A one-off, yep. Could they make that claim that this leads to this? No. Did it lead to the gunshot? Had an impact, maybe. So it's not quite as simple as what we were trying to do. So back to in a research project like that, people would try and weigh out the intervening variables to be able to say, yes, this caused this. So here we are looking at a similar thing, aggressive behavior in children. Does preoccupation with it, with aggression, lead to aggressive behavior, which, whether it's children's stories or videos or so, here's what they did. They looked at 858 stories dictated to 201 children. So we ask ourselves, what are we interested in? We're interested in the story. The story. So our population is 858. The population is 858 stories, not what's this? That is our population, not this. This is where we got our data from. But of 858 stories, then what? And it gets dissected. We'll look at it in just a minute. So we're still in the intro. It gives us a quick idea. 200 children, that's a good size sample set. Age 2 to 6, telling stories. We have them read stories, tell us about it. So the huge giant comes into it, right? So let's slide down here and see what we get. They go through that, roughly an overview, tell us the story, but then here's what we're looking for. Here's who the participants are and how they went about data collection, right? What did they do? So look at this piece here, 858 stories again. Let me see if I can get that in the right place. That ain't gonna work. Erase. Sorry, I'm not as so hot with this. There we go. So we got our 858 stories. From 200 children. And then they do the math on it. So this is done, they made this very much a quantitative type research project. They've turned it into numbers and statistics to say, here's what we've got, here's what we got. And they do that further on down. 200, and here's the point, here's the sample. So 290 of the 858 stories contain aggressive elements. And so we looked at our population of stories, and 290 of the population, 290 is what we're going to look at, because we're interested only in aggressive stories. But we heard a whole bunch of stories. The population, out of the population, what we actually were able to draw on is this many that fit with our project. This becomes our sample size. We looked at 290 as a sample of the whole population. You good with me on that? Population to the sample? If you got questions, jump in now. So then we get to now the data collection piece. When we go down just a little bit further, they tell us a little bit more about it. They kept the original story, and then they do a copy with the children. And then as they go through it, they talk about their analysis. Now, let me look at what they tell us about who the children were. Would you like to tell a story how they went about it? So there's the steps. Oh, here it is here, to strive for balance. This is what I want you to do. So they use the term balance, and they talk about what they do here for balance. So here's what my mind does, because I'm thinking this research, investigative kind of headspace on it. So what do they mean by balance? Okay, they want a balanced representative sample. So they get children aged 2 to 5, because if they start at 5, they're 6 by the time they're done. And then you get gender. What does this mean now? In Toronto, what does it mean to say gender? Is it just little boys and little girls? Do we have children that have been raised now as in a non-binary environment, so they're not told or directed? If you only do, and here's the balance piece, they think they're being balanced, and this is where bias shows up, good or bad. Now, they might say gender. In many places in the world, gender is still just little boys and little girls. So they can say it was a little boy or a little girl, that's it. But I'm going to suggest in some parts, and certainly in big urban centers where we've broken out of that sort of identification, we've said children can self-identify. And they can self-identify as a boy, as a girl, as non-binary. They can identify as they wish. Our issue with gender has become, how do you identify, as opposed to what's your body parts. So the physiology is typically what they would go with in this. But you could have a little boy. If the little boy says, you say, okay, you're little, okay, the little boy said this, all the little boys over, and he says, and one of them goes over and stands with the girls. And they say, no, you're a little boy. And it's, no, I'm a girl. What do? Do you move him or do you leave him where he is? Leave that him in the broad sense of him, sorry, because I've done it. But do you leave that little physiological boy with the physiological girls, or do you say, no, you're a boy, over you go over there? So that would play into the way you would gather your data and the way you'd report it. If you're thinking about gender in that broader sense, you've got to have categories for it, which might be other. Consider when you get to other, though, with gender. If you do male and female and other, if that was, now let's take it out of little children. Let's go with ourselves now. If you're in a position of where you identify in a way other than different than the typical binary male female role, if you identify in a different way, and the categories when you come to do my survey say male, female, other, do you think that might lead you to say this doesn't reflect me? Could it be, if I say, what's your race? And there's a bad word, I'm going to talk about race in a minute. But if I say to you, in a survey, race, and your selection is white, black, other. Now I say it'd be more appropriate to say color. But how many of you, if that was the options, would maybe check other, but how many say that, like, that's not right? How did I become just other? Do you think there'd be any element of potentially feeling a bit kind of left out of it in using that term other, if you've got to identify an other category?
Yes.
I do. As adults, we could. So imagine it's 2 to 5 year olds.
I have a question.
Jump, yeah.
So what happens if you were to do the male, female, other, and in that other category, there's only 2 people, like we talked about before. So then you're singling out those 2 people.
I would probably leave their data out. Because it would single them out, and I would probably say or I would try and find a way, and here's where, we're never supposed to do it, but yeah, I think the most important person is protecting them. So, and how they feel. So I would say, I would try, if there's a way that I could integrate their material in with some of the broader categories so that it could be reported on, but doesn't identify somebody, then I would try and draw it in that way. Otherwise, I would probably leave it out. I would err on the side of privacy. If I was able to ask them, then I would ask, or I would try and go and find some people to fit into that categories other than the 2 primary ones, so that I could get some data, even if I got to collect it later, to have enough to say you can't tell who's who. Does that help?
Yeah.
That's a good one. Excellent. That's a realistic problem you run into. So I'd be saying, how do I do this? How do I get done what I want, but not put somebody at risk? And it can get difficult. So if you do male, female, other, boy, girl, other with children, and you say, okay, go stand where you want, are you a boy, you a girl, or other? What does that say to the 2 or 3 year old? Like, the whole point of non-binary is to not force them into something, but what we've done is force them into being ostracized, maybe. Or not ostracized, they might feel ostracized even if they aren't. The other kids maybe don't care until you raise the issue. So it becomes, this is where that headspace and the whole course is ethics, because all the way through it, it's that thing about, wow, how would I do this? How would I collect data? How do I report on data? How do I reflect the interests of people without causing somebody some harm? So those things play into it. So gender. So they've tried to balance by gender. I'm going to suggest they probably went little boy, little girl, but here we would not. We would broaden that. I would broaden that out if there's any other children that identify different ways. The other is, they say ethnic, racial, and economic diversity are goals and part of the enrollment process. Okay. so you get single parent, low income families, and racial and ethnic background that are not European. So I have trouble with the race thing because how can you, in Toronto, how do you know somebody's race? We can say your color. You might even be say genetically where you look like people from a similar particular part of the world, geographic similarities because of where we were growing up. But race is a social political category. It is not biology. Race is terms used, and it is for one to be able to disempower the other, take from them, do to them. They don't count. They're less. It's maybe not xenophobia, but certainly the othering, which will come up later on in the course. That idea of making them an other, and an other that doesn't count. That's the purpose of race. It's to do that. It's not about recognizing and celebrating our variations. So the fact that they did race in this says to me, that troubles me. These are supposed to be academics. Now, this is a little bit older, so they may be not as tuned in, but I've been tuned in for a decade thinking what's wrong with race, with that term of race. So I'm not sure how in academia you could say racial difference. If it's written in the US, there you go. That to me says, well, there you go. That's an American influence. Because the American history, the whole history of America is split on color lines, but they called it race because race let them, the dominant white European, essentially culture, dominate, take from, disempower the black population. That's not race, that's power. So whenever you see race in an academic paper, if it's old, maybe. If it's not an old paper, look at where they're coming from when they're writing and what does that mean? What's their interpretation? We are supposed to know better. How in the world, and I got a master's. I cannot grasp how anybody with a PhD can just talk race. I say, have you been asleep for the last decade? That's what your business is, your livelihood. So the ethnic background, you would want to know what they mean. Just like I said earlier, the vehicle versus truck. Do you include passenger ones? Do you say all vehicles? Do you say, I'm only looking at passenger cars, I'm looking at trucks? That's like saying ethnic background. What ethnic backgrounds do you have in the room? Now, is that geography or is that biology? And if you ask somebody and say, oh, what's your background? They say, oh, I'm Indian. Okay, good. What does that mean? Now, for me, that sort of to me indicates India, right? The country. Actually, no, what it might mean is a generation of people who are, when they say that, they're actually indigenous peoples, but they still use the old term that we don't use anymore because we know it's inappropriate. They can use it as long as they want. It's about them. But if I hear that term Indian, if it's written on a piece of paper right off my mind, I say, how old are they? What do they mean by that? If they say South Asian, okay, pick a country. If they say Asian, pick a country. If you say American, okay, that's the middle of North America. I'm not sure how that became all of America, but somehow it did. So those terms become categories. You, when you read them, should be able to understand what they are. So they may not do a great job of dissecting this down. That's just the way I think. In this, I've got a broad idea. They're trying to get a broad scope of children who variation in the project. It is a diverse, it's not all a homogenous group they're looking at. And the schools automatically are set up anyways to give priority to children from single parents, low incomes, and families with racial, like people who aren't from a European background. Irish, Scottish, English, but what do they mean by European? How about Syrians? About Serbs or Croatians, or those things start to come in and say, not European European American. What do they mean by European American? I'm going to bet this is dominant European American. They're going to be talking England, Ireland, Scotland, Welsh, Wales, those bunch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, German, maybe Czech, Ukraine, Polish, like they're going to be looking at those parts of the world, right? Then Scandinavian countries. Are they going to include Russia? Russia's not really Europe anymore. Like, where does that European line draw? What does that mean? So really they're trying to identify here without saying it flat out. But what I get in this is kids who are going to school who are in probably a less empowered place, or their families are a less empowered place. That's what they're trying to capture. But they can't say that. So they work around it and they try to give us our categories. When you see the categories, question what does the category mean? Who's included? More importantly, who's excluded? That is the big issue for me. Who's not included whenever you look at any category thing? Who got left out? Who chose to go out? You had male, female, other. A whole bunch of people say, forget that, I'm trans, I'm not doing that. You didn't include me, I'm not included. What's the matter with you? I'm not doing it. So they're out, they're not included. Who's left out? They're left out maybe because of the way I wrote it or the way I looked at it, reviewed it. So, then we get the massive stories from age 2 to 6. Most of the stories collected were for 4-year-olds, so it breaks down again within it. Of these 290 stories, so again, this is our sample size. Does that help? Going through a write-up where people have laid out their sampling process? I hope. I'll go with I hope it does. So, thank you. I knew I could count on you. Even if you're still in bed, right? Go back to bed. So here's where that data collection, what they did with it. They drew it from all of here. Here's our sampling, and then here's what we did. And it makes sense of it. That's why this article's in. It's not on the test, but if you understand it, I think you're in a good place. So there was something else I was going to talk about there. Is there anything else that you wanted to go over? Because it was a very short video. I'm thinking I will post this video as well because it might be helpful. It's got a little more material in it than the original. The original, I ran through it really quick to give you an idea. But sampling, anything else comes out of sampling for you? Hello. I'm just gonna quickly look at the PowerPoint, but I think we've covered it off. Because there's only a few slides to it, and then there's all the numbering. So the words in that box, right? The check box on the left, make sure you know those. Those are not iffy concepts. That should be, as soon as you hear population, you say, oh, that's everybody could be picked from. We're going to come up to inductive and inductive again later in the course, but certainly this is our beginning point. So if we had have done the original one, I would have sent you to a library, and in the library had you look at the number of books there, just because we can all have the same thing. So that picture did the same thing. Could you do you feel, and this really is a show of hands, do you feel if you had to do a research project now, you'd be able to report on think about how to select who to get your data from, and you would be able to write it up and say, here's who I collected from and here's why? Yes, no, oh, is there a thumbs down? Yep. You can put the crying in if you don't think you'd be able to, but wave or thumbs up, good. That's really all you need to come out of this week with, is the idea that you think, oh, I'd be able to figure this out. So the qualitative versus quantitative is we're thinking about a little bit. Because the qualitative researchers, by their very nature, you start right off selecting. If I was going to do a survey with this group, or I was going to, or do interviews. And with survey, I just ask everybody a set of questions, and then I take the data, put it in a spreadsheet, figure out what comes out of it. If I do quantitative, process. Excel spreadsheet there's a spreadsheet. All of that data goes in, and then I can sort it out later. I can change it by any one category. I could change it by gender. I could change it by by year of school you're in. That's the luxury of quantitative. And you get large numbers to work with, like they did with those stories. In qualitative, though, I'm going to do long interviews. I'm going to pick 4 people to interview. How do I decide who I'm going to interview? Depending on my topic, I will decide. If my topic is, what do you think about online learning? Then does it matter? Does gender really an issue in it? Maybe, but I'm going to say on the face of it, probably not. I may not worry about getting gender. If I'm going to ask specifically though, how you feel about me teaching the class, then it might matter. How do you feel about this professor? And you kind of get those with the surveys at the end of a course about how happy or unhappy you were with the course. But so if I wanted to do one though and say, it may not show up in that survey. They don't say in the survey, is your professor a chauvinist? Is your professor a misogynist? When they give examples, are they derogatory towards females? They're not asking that question. I might. And if that was my concern, whether it's myself, if in my position I was concerned about things I've said that I said, you know what, I should double check this. I then might run a survey, or someone else hears that I am. Maybe the boss hears that I am and says, what do you, what's he doing in his class, and runs a survey with everybody. He's going to need, a random sample doesn't work. Because if he goes random, here, true random sample, this is the problem with true random. If you put, we've got, I don't know, 40 of us in here, 39 of us in the room. Take me out of it, 38. Everybody's name goes in a hat. So here's what random looks like. I'm going to sidestep to random and come back. The random is all your names going in a hat. Let's say 3 people are going to get 100% in this course. You don't have to do any more work. You're done 100%. 3 people, we're going to do it random out of a hat. All your names go in, pull out a name, look at it, say, oh, look, this person gets 100%. And then it goes right back into the same hat. And then you pull out a name, and it may be the same name. That's true random. I don't like it. It's rarely used. It is used in the lotteries, though. I think Sick Kids, Princess Margaret, those lotteries. If there's 100,000 tickets and you buy one, your one ticket is in that bin. And when they roll it and reach in and pull one out, your odds are 1 in 100,000. And then they put it back in the bin, and the odds of the next one are 100,000. 1 in 100,000. That's a true random sample. We tend to do a modified random. I take your name out. I say, oh, this person won. They got 100%. And then I put it away sideways. Now the odds are 1 in 99 because I'm reaching in to pull out another ticket and see who gets it. So the odds will change in a modified random. Where in a random, they never change. So back to, if the issue was, how do I lecture, or are there comments I'm making that are disparaging? They'd run that. If they just run a random sample, they come up with 4 guys to say, whatever, what's misogyny, right? What are you talking about? They don't hear it. Do you think women in the room, if I had disparaging comments directed towards women though, do you think that women might be more conscious of that than men? Does it seem sort of natural? I think. You might catch on to it. If I make disparaging comments about color, I'm going to bet if you're on the receiving end of it, you'll clue in. If you've heard humor based in culture or geography or skin color, if you've heard that humor, you might feel it differently when it's you that it's being addressed. George Lopez, there was this comedian, I don't know, 20 years ago, Mexican comedian, hilarious guy. But I bet in some of the stuff he said, some people from Mexican descent probably said, wow, he got that. And others are saying, that's not right. So Scottish humor, everybody's got it. Irish humor, same thing. It's everybody's got it. So you might feel the bite. So when you're doing social research, you're thinking about the topic, you've got to make sure your sample is properly reflective. Do I want 4 women in my sample if I'm going to do 4 interviews? I might. If I'm going to lean to one group over there, I'm going to lean by gender to 4 women. Or I might say, is there anybody in the room who identifies other than male? So female, trans, yeah, you know what, we should hear from you too, because you might have some insight that's really valuable. I may not need to hear from the guys too much, because the issue is chauvinism, misogyny, those sorts of something around that. So I may not need to hear it, but they might still be worth hearing from. So the interviews, I might interview 1 guy and 3 people who identified, but I only want, so I'm going to categorize my room first, select from those categories. Okay, from the category who identifies male, okay, 1, I need to hear from 1. I should get some input, so it's an unbiased sampling, but I just need 1 because I want to make sure I hear more from those that it would more reflect. Does that make sense in a real thing about choosing which way would I go? How do I collect my data and from whom? Yes, no. So it's thumbs up or crying. Crying helps because then I know I didn't get it. Yeah. Are we okay? All right, then I need to come around a little more. So if I'm selecting my sample, so the process of deciding who to collect my data from is the process of sampling. And if my topic has got a particular concern for in it, then I need to lean my sample group towards that concern. I need to select from my whole population, all 39 of you. I need to have my sample reflective of the group, but reflective of the group related to this particular topic. If the topic is how good am I at teaching, then I can pick from anybody, right? I can do modified random in the room. I'm going to interview 4 people for what? You know what? Here's an idea. I'm going to get 1 from each and I think that's what I do in the video online. I get 1 from each program. I get 1 from each. I make sure I've got somebody in who speaks to different gender issues. I make sure that I've got people who speak to different age categories. So I've got someone who can speak to it. That's qualitative. I'm going to be very concerned about trying to capture those categories in some way reflected. It won't be 1 person from every category. It could be 1 person who speaks to several categories. That's good. But it's that I get some sense of the feel of it. Qualitative will do that. Quant, get it from everybody and then sort it out later. On the spreadsheet, press this button, say if this is the independent variable, then what? That's what I do. But in qualitative, I'm going to be very careful to try and identify categories and make sure that I can get some reflection of thought from that. Good. All right. Well, if that's it, if you're all feeling all right, then I think we're good. So that midterm is later in the week. Do it. And this will line us up. So in the email I sent you last week is, so when we come back on week 6, you're going to be the first lecture on interviewing. And then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday will be the same lectures again on interviewing. So you can jump in online. If you want to come and you don't make Monday, you can make Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You can do it. If you want to do it twice, you can. The interviews will show up online. You need to do the quiz and the read the chapter, do the quiz and the labs by Tuesday of week 6. So there's a couple that are coming up, survey and interview. So the survey lab. Yeah, go ahead. The survey lab. 30 minutes doing surveys. Try them out. If you do it somewhere in that, you're probably, and just do some surveys. When you see it, you're going to see some questions that just don't work. There'll be something that'll say like, do you have a car? No. Do you like cars? No. What's your favorite color car? And I'd look at that question and say, what is that? Will you sleep? Like how does that fit? So I want you to look for something like that. I say to look for an illogical question. It's a question that you, when you read it, say, wow, where does that come from? Good. If you've read questions looking for that, you will read lots of questions. And as you read them, you'll start to see how the questions are asked, the order of the questions, the logic. There's a logic that goes with the way the survey is written. So that's all I want you to do, get exposed to the questions, the way questions are worded, and the answers that are offered to you in a survey. Get exposed to that. That's good. And then submit a picture. I don't care how you do it, a screenshot, anything that says, here's the picture, here's the question I found was bad. The reason I tell you to look for an illogical question, it'll push you to spend some time doing it. If you don't find one in 30 minutes, then check out. Just submit a document, say, here's the websites I went to, I didn't find one. That's fine. That's okay too. If you spent 30 minutes looking at questions, good. That's what I want you to do. Spend 30 minutes looking at doing surveys to look at and think about how the questions are asked and the answers they offer you. They offer you radio buttons. They offer you a choice. They've already decided what the categories of answer are. Back to the gender issue. So the interview, then the other lab, 15-minute interview, 15 minutes. If you do that 15 minutes, if you're going to, don't go over 15. That's the key. If you do 10 questions, yeah, 10's good. 10 on what did you do yesterday? That's the topic. During the topic, you look and say, you're going to interview somebody. I think interview a child. A child is really interesting if you can, if you know somebody, not some random child walking down the street, right? Oh, but if there's a child, you know they're good because they will take you in very different places than you're ready. And if they know you, then do they answer you, don't they? So have a set of 10 questions written out before you do your interview, and then try and do it. And the interview is just, what did you do yesterday? That's it. See how far you get in 15 minutes. Some of you won't get very far. You get a couple of questions done. Some of you get all the way through it. Doesn't matter. Do whatever it is. 15 minutes, stop. It's got you thinking about how do I ask questions? How do I formulate them? Different than the survey. That's the key in it. The survey, it's all answers selected. You're going to ask questions that are more open-ended. So do your best, do the best you can, and we'll roll on from that. Okay. So if you do,
I have some questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
So that's it for the interview. Try and write it up as best you can. That's something to talk about as well. But both of them, wing it, try it out, submit it, 100%, show up. We talked about it in week 6.